Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our new students, um, and welcome to our examination of Daphne du Maurier and the elements of Gothicism in her work, Rebecca. Um, Many of you know this already, but the dog that you're going to see, who's yes, that dog right over there in the reflection of my china cabinet, that dog I named after Daphne du Maurier. Her name is Daphne, and she is frequently uh, an interrupter in the program, but that's mostly where she sits. Anyway, as you have probably seen from the syllabus, I have included a quick meander through a couple of short stories before we get to Du Maurier, The Telltale Heart, The Raven, and The Yellow Wallpaper, because they each illustrate a number of the points that we are going to look for when we are examining Rebecca. So I picked short stories and a poem because they're quick reads and because they can illustrate the elements of Gothic. Gothicism isn't as simple as darkness and chains and ghosts and that kind of thing. There's a number of other pretty sophisticated techniques used by those writers who utilize Gothicism. Gothicism is a type of work, this is the definition, is a type of work characterized by horror, violence, supernatural effects, and a bit of the medieval, often set against the background of Gothic architecture, especially a gloomy and isolated castle. It isn't always part of it, but we will see it. The history of Gothicism, as we know it, originated with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, which was published in 1764. Sometimes the supernatural is given a naturalistic explanation, aiming to produce a probable cause. Historically, Gothic works sometimes ventured towards parody, sometimes merging with Orientalism, or even the supernatural, which was to become symbolic in American fiction, the works of Edgar Allan Poe. So we will see some of this symbolism in these works. We will see the symbolism also play out in Rebecca, in the novel Rebecca. So the first thing I'm going to talk to you about is an introduction of Gothicism. This is another element of my classes. I can't lock her up in the laundry room because she'll just bark. So anyway, this is an overview and the of the history and the into the current age. People really like Gothic novels. Look at Stephen King. People love it. They just gobble it up. It originated, as I said, with Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, published in 1764. It was the genre's first bestseller. Popular with readers from its inception to the present day, Bram Stoker's Dracula, for example, has never been out of print since its initial publication in 1897. I thought that was really an interesting fact. It has also become interconnected with the detective fiction and science fiction genres in the 20th century. The term Gothic typically refers, hold on, we've got a weather alert here, we don't need that, typically refers to the occurrence of supernatural or horror elements in fiction, such as the ghost stories like Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles. Henry James's Turn of the Screw is another example. That was in 1898. Or in works of terror like Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So you can see it takes many forms. As is traditional for Gothic texts, strange events are presented in a stylized, formal, sometimes ritualistic manner. Yet the term Gothic is also used for works imbued with a weird or troubling atmosphere, such as Faulkner's Light in August, published in 1932, or the peculiar tales of Flannery O'Connor. In the modern era, Gothic has come to denote pieces that feature mankind's dark side, whether violent, erotic, nonconformist, or bizarre. Think of Flannery O'Connor. Scholars have pointed out that contemporary Gothic is always driven by desire and complex human psychological states. Now, Walpole's piece was published in 1764, and from the late 1700s to the early 1800s, the whole genre really took off. Earlier Gothic works relied on physical phenomena for effect, such as haunted houses, ghosts, vampires, crazed and murderous individuals, whereas contemporary Gothic turns inward. This is going to be important. We are going to see this in the pieces that we're going to look at, the short pieces, but also in Rebecca. It turns inward to explore buried emotions that motivate individuals to pursue their secret obsessions and guilty pleasures. In effect, the imminent danger that has shifted to the internal rather than the external origins. We'll see that right off the bat when we talk about Telltale Heart. Gothic texts are generally conservative, since the events they portray ultimately end with the restoration of social order. Another group of theorists, critics of Gothicism, regards the ultimate goal of the genre to be the subversion of social order in order to bring about change. So there's those two camps. The first one sees the social order being returned, and the second camp sees the social order subverted in these tales, where we are examining the inner motivation of people and their behavior. Contemporary scholars of Gothic have also explored its connections with feminism, particularly in regard to definition of gender roles and women's search for identity. Clearly, one of the elements playing out in the yellow wallpaper. So it's connected to the return of the social order, or the subversion of the social order to bring about change, or in the role of women and gender identity. That's really important. That's all I have to say about that one. I have a very long article here written by Coral Ann Howells. Coral. It's C-O-R-A-L. Coral Ann Howells. It was published in 2014. She is a lecturer at the University of Reading. And she's talking about the development of Gothicism, and she particularly focuses on the years between 1790 and 1820. But from this, we can discern what are the elements of Gothicism. Of course, one very clear example of Gothicism appears in Dickens' The Christmas Carol. We have ghosts, we have chains, we have ghostly dreams. Anybody who has seen The Christmas Carol at Christmas time would recognize these characteristics. So I'm going to read a few, but I'm going to also, a few of these paragraphs, but I'm also going to summarize for you so you can take notes and observe these elements in the pieces of fiction that we're going to talk about. So this Coral Ann Howell says, I want to. She begins with it's sorry. This is the title is Gothic Themes, Values, Techniques, and she begins with a quote by Horace Walpole: "One must have taste to be sensible of the beauties of Grecian architecture. One only wants passions to feel Gothic." Gothicism as a genre is about conveying feeling. She says, I want to adopt Horace Walpole's emphasis on feeling as the distinctive attribute of Gothic. Feeling as it is explored and enacted in the fictions themselves, and feeling as the primary response elicited from the reader. That's why we like it, because it elicits feeling in us. That is why Stephen King is so immensely popular, because he tries to scare the bejeebers out of us. And in many cases he does. I haven't read much of King, but if you have, it might be worth going back to read something, because he's the contemporary version of what I'm going to tell you. As its name suggests, with its medieval associations, Gothic is allied with everything which is the opposite of Augustan. So what we're seeing is a pendulum swing away from rationalism towards feeling and the irrational. Instead of notions of order and decorum and rational judgment, Gothicism represents the darker side of awareness, the side to which sensibility and imagination belong, together with those less categorizable areas of guilt, fear, and madness, which are such important and terrifying components of the earlier Augustan anti-vision and of Romanticism. So that's important, because Gothicism is a subcategory of the Romantic. That's why we see it develop to such a degree during this time period. Gothic fiction, with its castles and abbeys, persecuted heroines, ghosts and nightmares, projects a peculiarly fraught fantasy world of neurosis and morbidity. So what we have here is an emphasis on feeling, with an occasional throwback to a medieval castle. The darker side of awareness, guilt, fear, and madness, castles and abbeys and monasteries, the persecuted heroines, ghosts and nightmares, in the world of neuroses and morbidity. Particularly, we're going to see neuroses surely today because of Poe. Poe, of course, was interested in conveying the neurotic. And in some of my research and in my past experience with Poe, and you all probably know this as well, that Poe he seemed to always have his foot in rational and then in the neurotic. When we get to a little bit to his biography, I will tell you a little bit about his past. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Poe, because that's not really our function today. So I'll go on with this continued description of what Gothic themes, values, and techniques are. Its main areas of feeling treat of melancholy, anxiety-ridden sentimental love, and horror. It is a shadowy world of ruins and twilight scenery, lit up from time to time by lurid flashes of passion and violence. Think about Poe. One of the stories that I had thought about bringing to you from Poe, today we're going to talk about The Telltale Heart, but another one, if you want to read another Poe, it's another quick read, is The Cask of Amontillado. That is horrifying. If you remember that story, one character entices another character down into the wine cellars under the city and bricks him up behind the wall because he wanted to get revenge. That's Poe's point. That's what revenge feels like. So all the time we have the uncomfortable sense of being in a fantasy world which is about to reveal secrets of the human personality. Indeed, straining towards these revelations, and yet constantly kept in check by the negative forces of guilt and repression. It is this sense of an imprisonment, which is both psychological and linguistic. So, melancholy, anxiety-ridden sentimental love, horror, ruins and shadows, passion, violence, repression. A lot of the scenes in Gothic pieces take place at night. Think about Telltale Heart and the yellow wallpaper. Oh, wait till we get to that one. So, wait, who said this? Robert Keeley published an article about Gothicism, and really he published a work about romantic fiction, and in it he talked about the Gothic part of it, and he says, this was published in 1973 in a book entitled The Romantic Novel in England, and he says, the emotions on which they dwelt were too imperfectly understood or too threatening to be systematically rationalized, except by someone as daring as the Marquis de Sade. Now, if you remember, the Marquis de Sade was really, he freed himself of all the passions of his period. And as we know, his name, Sade, became part of the concept of sadism or sexual cruelty. Yikes. So this was the kind of, he explored these things in a way that other people weren't bold enough to do. And so what we see in Gothicism is an exploration of some of the darker elements of human beings. Keeley goes on, they explored feelings and compulsions, which were not merely impolite to mention, but often difficult to label and describe. One didn't talk about one's darker motivations. One just didn't. His statement, now I'm going back to, what's her name? Coral. What's her last name? Howells, that's right. His statement was particularly interesting for the Gothic novelists. The very bizarreness of whose fictions show how daring their attempts were to articulate some of the more disconcerting features of the life of feeling. Disconcerting features of the life of feeling. Gothic fiction, she goes on to say, is a literature full of curiosity, doubt, and anxiety. Curiosity in exploring these darker elements of human beings, and anxiety about those darker feelings. All they knew was that they were dissatisfied and anxious. These are the writers. Their fiction is both exploratory and fearful. They are not always totally in control of their fantasies, the characters in these fictions, for having opened up new areas of awareness which complicate life enormously. The writers then retreat from their insights back into conventionality with the rescue of a heroine into a happy marriage. Remember, I said that one camp of Gothic writers and critics of Gothicism say that what it does is it returns the world back to the social order. This is a profound, I lost my place. And the horrible death of a villain There is a profound unease and fear of anarchy, which run side by side with the expressions of frustration at conventional restraints throughout Gothic fiction. That is a summary of the point. I'm going to read it again because it's important. There is a profound unease and fear of anarchy, which runs side by side with the expressions of frustrations at conventional restraints throughout Gothic fiction. So if you have a heroine who is married by the end, that would be that conventional way of retreating, a conventional retreat to social order. But in a work of fiction, which we will absolutely see in our works, there is an exploration of those darker parts of us, and we are waiting for the solution. Howells goes on to say that Gothic fiction is a most ambiguous form, for like romance, it emphasizes the intuitive, the arbitrary, and the supernatural. This is something that Henry James calls the disconnected and uncontrolled experience. That came from the preface to The American. He calls it the disconnected and uncontrolled experience. It is exactly what Gothicism is. Problems of personal, moral responsibility and judgment, questionings of restrictive convention, and a troubled awareness of the irrational impulses which threaten to subvert orthodox notions of social and moral propriety. Therein is the conflict. We know what is the social expectation, and yet underlying this is this darkness that apparently we all possess. These anxieties occur with obsessional frequency in Gothic fiction, and those sublimated into forms which appear fabulous and unlikely. They are at the same time distorted images of real emotions and tensions and moral dilemmas. It's a really interesting way of approaching Gothicism beyond just ghosts and darkness. It's really a deeper exploration. Gothic writers were certainly expressing attitudes which were hostile to 18th century enlightened view of human potential. Again, as I said, it's the pendulum swing. Just a reference to Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre, and I will talk more about Jane Eyre. I don't think I'm going to get to it today, but Bronte revolted against these restrictive conventions for treating sexual love. But even Mr. Rochester still has some of the devilish fascination of the traditional Byronic hero villain about him. Neither Bronte was entirely free of convention in this respect, and emotional indulgence were more timid than the Brontes. We'll get back to Bronte. So there is an emotional tension between violent physical effects and perplexed incomprehension. Again, there's a tension between the two camps, two ways of solving these underlying emotional tendencies. The tension is between violent physical effects and perplexed incomprehension. As a result of this preoccupation with externals, Gothic novels have frequently been criticized for being sensational, theatrical, and melodramatic. And sometimes, where's my book? Sometimes Maurier has been accused of that, theatrics and the sensational. And sometimes du Maurier's novels have been relegated maybe to the second tier of fiction. And yet, I'm sure if you have gotten into it, if you've started to read it, um, it's a compelling read compared to what we saw in Portrait of an Artist, or Portrait of a Lady last semester. This is not as dense as Henry James, but the story's really good. Um, these writers exactly describe the peculiar quality and the contemporary appeal of Gothic fiction. The sensational, theatrical, and melodramatic. I love it. That's, I think, why Stephen King is so popular. I don't have a whole lot more, but another very interesting reference in this work by Howells. She talks a very short while about Shakespeare, and particularly Macbeth and Hamlet. They appear to have been the most popular plays, providing as they do for models for almost every kind of dramatic crisis by which men's passions are revealed, from supernatural fear to murder, revenge, madness, distracted love, melancholy, and agonized penitence. Think about Lady Macbeth. She's got blood on her hands, and she screams, "Out, damn spot! Out, damn spot!" We see women characters with blood on their hands. We see characters who are mad, telltale heart. We see characters who have distracted love. So we're going to see that in much of what we're going to read. But I just thought that was an interesting reference. I had never thought of Hamlet or Macbeth as being Gothic, and that was way before Gothic novels developed. And yet, sure enough, all of those scenarios appear in Shakespeare, which are then borrowed by these Gothic writers. It demonstrates how pervasive the Shakespearean influence was, for Shakespeare's plays provided a picturesque vocabulary of feelings which satisfied the current taste for highly wrought emotions and inflated language. I just thought that was really insightful. Another thing, this author goes on to talk about facial expressions and how Gothic writers employ those. So it's something to pay attention to. Inevitably, in the novels, as in the theater, because her point was that through Shakespearean theater and then later on in other theatricals, it was an important element of engaging the audience. The facial expressions. You cannot have an actor on stage without facial expression. Inevitably, I didn't finish my sentence. Inevitably, in the novels, as in the theater, certain patterns of facial expressions and gesture came to be associated with certain feelings, just as appearance indicated certain types of character. You have despairing groans, chilly agues of terror, distracted looks. Think about Hamlet. Deathly cheeks, streaming tears of rapture. Watch, especially when we get to Du Maurier, watch the facial expressions. Virginia Woolf made an interesting observation. By the time Virginia Woolf was writing, of course, the Gothic novels had sometimes come to be parodied, and she says, Virginia Woolf points out that there are not many possible ways of registering shock and terror, and she kind of makes fun of this, Virginia Woolf. She was excessively smart. It is unlikely that a lady confronted, this is kind of funny, by a male body, stark naked, wreathed in worms, where she had looked, maybe, for a pleasant landscape in oils, should do more than give, this is hilarious, a loud cry and drop senseless. Dropping senseless, it just really makes me laugh. It's kind of like in movies. Watch this. In movies, if you ever have a woman running through the forest in high heels, inevitably she falls. It's inevitable. Of course, what's she doing in high heels? I don't even know. But Virginia Woolf goes on and says, and women who give loud cries and drop senseless do it in much the same way. That is one of the reasons why it is extremely difficult to write a tale of terror which continues to shock and does not first become insipid and later ridiculous. So she is writing this much later, but the works that we're going to look at take Gothicism seriously. The Gothic novelists always tend to exaggerate emotional responses, so we find them more often depicting unusual heights and depths, that showing the vast intermediate area of variable feeling which comes in between. And that's probably true. I just thought we're not going to look at any parodies of Gothicism, but I just thought that Virginia Woolf kind of hit it on the head. People have a loud cry and drop senseless. It's hilarious. Virginia Woolf isn't all that funny, but I thought that was pretty funny. Another method much favored by these novelists for suggesting emotional states and atmosphere was through the presentation of landscape. So we've seen facial expressions, we've seen people fainting, we see these scenic landscapes, as in the castles and in abbeys. Edgar Allan Poe, of course, was not depicting in Telltale Heart an abbey or monastery. He has something else. We'll get to that. The novels are full of sublime and picturesque scenic descriptions, sometimes evoking a purely aesthetic response in the reader, but more frequently used as a kind of visual correspondence, suggestive of an inner psychological state. So the castles, surrounded by weather, as we see in Bronte, the weather reflects the inner state. I don't know how many of you get National Geographic, but there was a National Geographic that came out, I think it was about a month ago, in which the author was investigating the renovation of Notre Dame, the how it was burned. But when it was renovated in the late 1880s, the primary architect added gargoyles to the outside of Notre Dame. And I don't know, some of you have probably been to Notre Dame, and this is way up high, and the two towers that are still intact, gargoyles. How is that a reflection of Catholic religion? It reflects the interest in Gothicism of the period, 1880s. That was the first reno. I just thought that was immensely interesting. Okay. So I think that's all I have from this article. Oh no, more about the landscapes. This too can be exaggerated, the landscapes and the exteriors, the tranquil beauty of the country, the seemingly infinite corridors of castles, the dimness of moonlit landscapes, the ferocity of storms, the ruggedness of mountains, so that what began as an aesthetic response to environment becomes an imaginative recreation of the world. When we talk about dream landscapes in Gothic novels, we are talking about a fictive world whose topography is shaped by and is the shape given to emotional responses to uncertainty and threat. So it isn't just a stormy night, but actually a reflection of the stormy interior of the characters and the storminess of a situation of the internal workings of the mind. A number of remarkable attempts to explore the private hinterland of the human personality. That's what the landscapes are. These explorations are expressed through intense and exaggerated imagery in which contemporary readers found excitement, suspense, and beneath it all, an interplay of the passions they covertly recognized themselves as sharing. So the Gothic novel was immensely popular when this genre began to develop, but it's still interesting to people. Think about, you may have people in your histories or in your groups, people who are more fascinated with Halloween than any of the other major holidays. I know somebody like this, and that person spends much more time decorating for Halloween, and it's because of her fascination with this Gothic idea. Um, okay, that's it. I thought that was really insightful. Um, when I do this, I put it all in a pile in order. So I have a book um, by Clive Bloom and it's entitled Gothic Histories, The Taste for Terror, 1764 to the present. The book is only moderately useful to us, but in one particular chapter, I haven't finished this book. I got it yesterday. I just found it a couple of days ago on Amazon, and the miracle of Amazon, it comes the next day. So if we go to Poe first, and remember, I'm using Poe and later Gilman to demonstrate some of the pretty complex characteristics of Gothic. And this author says Poe is the best known and most recognizable of all the Gothic writers, but the obscurity of his upbringing, the manner of his squalid death, and the weirdness of his vision has led him by variously being accused of being a drunk, a drug addict, obsessional, and impotent. He did have a weird death. I'll get to his biography in a minute. He was 40 when he died, and he had been known to go on prolonged drunken bouts. And he was found one day in the street, passed out, in clothes that were not his own. Nobody really knows what he died of. It could have been, he's often been accused of being an opium, I think, smoker. You smoke opium? I'm not even sure. But because of that, he has always had this aura around him. And when I am beginning to teach some of my jail students about literature, if they get their GED and their HSED, then they sometimes want to stay on and read some of my textbooks. And I always start with Poe because you can see them, and I start with the Telltale Heart. You can see their eyes pop out of their heads when they get to the end. Let me go on, and I'll come back to Poe for a second. He was able to produce a new fiction in which personal neuroses were sublimated to the universal and often prurient interests of a reading public hungry for sensation literature which purported to be truthful. So my students who don't really get the structure of novels or short stories think that the I speaker in Telltale Heart is Poe. But we know that's not Poe. But they always think it is. And they think, boy, he was a strange dude. They say that. They call him dude. You know. Poe was a jobbing author, quite willing to take up snippets of information that he got from newspapers, which exploited the general fascination with mesmerism, being mesmerized, and with the afterlife, and even had medical men fooled despite its horror ending. In Telltale Heart, we don't have a medical man, we have police at the end. Yet his true achievement was to combine what psychomedical knowledge he could call from textbooks and the encyclopedia with insights into the emerging concerns of the mid-19th century with regard to cosmic ennui and alienation. He starts to explore those inner demons that would haunt the century, its thinkers and artists. And remember, when Poe was writing, Telltale Heart was published in 1843. Science was 20 years on the horizon, as was Freud, and it was even later than 20 years. It was 20 or 30 years. Freud often explored the internal. Before that, there wasn't much of a vocabulary to explore the internal. Poe began an exploration of the psychology of obsessional psychosis. That's exactly what we see in Telltale Heart. We see that in the Cask of Amontillado. We see it in the yellow wallpaper. Obsessional psychosis that was only categorized in the 20th century. So in the 1800s, of course, people were aware of this underlying darkness, but didn't have the Freudian vocabulary or the Jungian vocabulary to define it. I don't think I have anything else in this book. As I said, I just got it. Yeah, I think that's all I have. Okay, so if we go, oh no, wait, I have more. Those of you who know, have taken my classes before, I turn into the mad professor because I have piles of papers, and I find that I can't stop examining the material. I'm like a weird professor here, but I kept finding more things about Poe. First of all, his fiction frequently hints at the tormented psyche of a writer who precariously straddled the border between insanity and genius. My jail students think that he was just insane for writing some of these tales. But interestingly, this is a book that Jane suggested to me. It was is that the back? That's the back. This is the front. It gives small insights into the authors that we often examine. It's really a good book. It's really a good book. I got it on Amazon. So, according to the authors here, and I think this is true, Poe's legacy is this. In a career that lasted a mere decade, Poe transformed the literary landscape. That's interesting. Countless major British and American writers, from Hawthorne, Dickens, Melville, and Stevenson, to Wilkie Collins. Oh, we liked that class. And Agatha Christie, were inspired by Poe's strange genius. His ultra rational French detective, C. Auguste Dupin, who first appeared in The Murders at the Rue Morgue, was the forerunner for Conan Doyle's uh, famous super sleuth Sherlock Holmes. This is how, remember early on in that article, the author Howells said that this then developed beyond Gothicism into the detective story. You can totally see that. Prominent late 19th century French authors such as Baudelaire and Marlama, wait, I can't read this. Mallarmé was indebted to Poe's work, as are the symbolists and the surrealist movements. We're going to see symbolism. And his writing has also influenced popular culture, music, television. I keep losing my place because the print's really small. And cinema, notably the successful movie adaptations of the 1960s. And it has continued to inspire the genres of science fiction and fantasy fiction. In the last 50 years or so, his work has had particular resonance for literary theorists, including structuralists and post-structuralists, as well as for those interested in the relationship between literature and psychoanalytic theory. And we begin with the nuggets created by Poe. There apparently was a movie adaptation in 1935 of The Raven. Can you imagine? So let's turn to Poe. Oh yeah, here we go. If I put my papers in the wrong places, then we get lost. Okay, Poe, his dates were 1809 to 1949. He was 40. His stormy personal life, further confused by an unscrupulous executor, postponed honest evaluation of his place in American literature. I think that's really true. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor who really dismissed Poe. But we're going to look at him in detail in a minute. Orphaned as a child and taken in by somebody named John Allen, hence the name Edgar Allan Poe. And he lived with the Allens in England, where he had a classical education at a school called the Manor House School in London. Apparently, this was a miserable experience, but some of the settings that are in his fiction come from this from his experience at the school, most notably the fall of the House of Usher. If anybody has read that one recently, the character Usher is descending into madness while his castle around him is also beginning to decay. There is that reflection in the landscape of the decay of the interior mind. Later, he returned to the United States. He attended the University of Virginia, but he created so much debt from drinking and gambling that he had to leave the university. He then joined the military and went to West Point. I had forgotten that deal, but he didn't like it. And so he arrived in New York and eventually became editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. He did quite a lot. He wrote a lot of poetry, a lot of short fiction. And he also discussed his short fiction. But then, and here's one of the odd things about Poe. In 1935 or 36, I've seen this both dates. He married his 13-year-old first cousin. And the professor I had couldn't quite get over that. She died some number of years later. Again, I've seen 7 years and 11 years. She died of TB, apparently had a pulmonary aneurysm that let go. The poem Annabel Lee is about her. and he wrote, starting in 1835 or 36, his Tales of the Grotesque. He eventually went to Philadelphia, continued to write about criticism. I told you about his internal anguish and his tormented psyche. Well, of course, we can see he's tormented, and he died after much drinking. So if we go to Poe, here are the Gothic elements, in case you missed them, which I'm sure you didn't. Madness, death, murder. My students they never, and his hatred of the eye. My students can't ever figure that out. They say, why is he so obsessed with that eye? What's the matter with the eye? Well, I also then tell them, and this is something that we should pay attention to, is this is not Poe. I tell them, my students, this is the eye speaker, who is, of course, not necessarily reliable. And I also would like to point out that if you are ever at a cocktail party or a family gathering and someone comes in and insists they are not mad, you wonder. Of course you wonder. And one of the characteristics in short fiction, and we'll see this in Du Maurier as well, one of the characteristics is irony. And of course, we know when we begin the Telltale Heart, true, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses. We know he's got some sort of something, some phenomenon, which he calls disease, that's eating away his brain or his sanity. Not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I tell you the whole story. In that paragraph, we have so many of the elements that I referred to from this article. The contrast between the interior and the exterior. We have the madness of his mind. And he's going to tell us a story, and he's going to tell it to us in a clear, detailed way. But we also have the character whom he murders and then dismembers and buries underneath the floorboards. Oh my gosh! This is not in a castle. It's in a rooming house. We don't have any persecuted heroines, but we certainly have the other character who is persecuted. This is the world of neurosis and morbidity and horror. So let's go back to the text. This was in my own book from college. We see that he describes on the second page of whatever version you have, he is moving the door ever so slowly so that he can look in on the man with the eye. And my students always ask, what's the matter with his eye? Why is this guy so obsessed with it? And the best thing I can tell them is that he's obsessed perhaps with an eye that's got a cataract in it. He does say something about it having a film over it. But I'm sure that some of you have had cataracts. He also this could be an eye that is wandering. I'm sure you know people with a wandering eye. And there's something wrong with his obsession with it. But what are we thinking about this guy? Well, that he has some sort of underlying anxiety over the eye. If we look, this is about the 4th paragraph in. Upon the 8th night, so he's been stalking this guy. I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. And here's a really beautiful phrase. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. It's really dark. And he goes on to say in the next paragraph, I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening. And the man gets up. Oh my gosh, I'm sure you jumped when you got this. I was quite still and said nothing. So one thing that we know about Poe is that he is very astute at creating tone and mood. We jumped, I sure did, when the man got up and said, who's there? And yet the eye speaker remains perfectly still. He has fine-tuned his ability to be still. At the end of, that was what, the 4th paragraph? I'm trying to do this so you can keep up with me. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7th paragraph. Towards the end. Because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. I'm sure you can visualize this. He is now in the room, and his black shadow is touching the sleeping man. Really tense reference, description. And then in the next, I forgot what paragraph that was, 7th, and then 8th, at the end of the 9th paragraph, sure as can be, there is a reference to Macbeth. For I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. I had written that when I took this class and when I read the stories the first time. I had written Lady Macbeth here, but when I saw the reference in that article to having drawn thematics from Shakespeare, it was kind of an enlightening moment. And if we go over, I don't even know what paragraph. So, as you know the story, here's another element of Gothic. We've got this mood. It's dark. He's sneaking around at night. He is, in fact, stalking the man. And he kills him. Right? It's one of those, one of the elements identified. Murder. And then the anxiety begins. Where do we see anxiety? We see it when the cops come. Perhaps some neighbors have called the police because they heard the man scream. They come to the eye speaker's door, and he is horrified. But his own anxiety and his guilt gives him away. The cops, they are making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. And eventually he turns on himself because of the guilt of the horror of having killed the man. And he turned on himself. And very last paragraph. Villains, I shriek, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the plank. Hear, hear, it is the beating of his hideous heart. And we're shocked. I don't know if you've read this tale in a while, but it's pretty shocking that he goes to that length. And it was a low about a half a paragraph up. It was a low, dull, quick sound, much a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. So it might be that his own heart was making the sound. It might also be that he had wrapped the man's watch, in a bit of cloth and buried it under the floorboards as well. One way or the other, he took it to be the man's heart, which we know it's not, but it's his own anxiety. And so it is an anxiety-ridden horror. But do we think he's sorry? Probably not. But an interesting close to this is that, like what this woman identified, that, where did I write that? Oh, that the world is then put to right. Remember, there are those opposing forces that at the end of some Gothic fiction, the world is put to order. At the end of some other Gothic fiction, the world is changed by whatever discovery is made. So let's take a look also. You should see the mess I have here. All these things. Oh, let's take a look at the raven. You've probably heard this recited. It's just it's pervasive. It's so pervasive that at Halloween, if you go into Pottery Barn sells little stuffed figures of ravens. I don't have a picture of it. Because a raven is a bird of ill omen. It is fabled to forebode death and bring infection and general bad luck. The former notion arises from the ravens following an army under the expectation of finding dead bodies to eat. The latter notion is an offshoot of the first, since it is noted that pestilence kills as fast as the sword. Isn't that interesting? I got that out of, I frequently use this book for these classes. I have a very thick book, it's about that thick, about symbols. And I thought that that was really appropriate to the vision that we see here in the poem, The Raven. I picked this because we see in a short story the elements of Gothicism. We can also see it in a poem. I was going to tell you. Oh, yeah. Philosophy of composition. I'm surprised I don't have this marked for you. Maybe I didn't even print it. I don't know what I did with it. Poe talks, as do many gifted writers. He writes about his fiction. I gotta find this. Hold on one second. I'm just gonna pause so that you don't have to see me shuffling my papers. So he wrote a piece of criticism called The Philosophy of Composition. And I cite this because he also talks about the process of creating effect, which is what Gothicism is. He says, it is only with the denouement, and he's talking about the raven, constantly in view that we can give a plot its indispensable air of consequence or causation. By making the incidents, and especially the tone at all points, tend to development of the intention. So it's the tone. And then he goes on, I prefer commencing with the consideration of an effect. And remember, I've seen this repeatedly, that Poe is getting greater respect in the overall literary world. And his gift is the creation of effect. Let's see, what else did I see here? He says, I select The Raven as the most generally known. It was immensely popular. It is my design to render it manifest that no one point in its composition is referable either to accident or intuition, that the work proceeded step by step to its completion with the precision and rigid consequence of a mathematical problem. One of the things that is known is that originally the bird in the poem was a parrot. And that's worth knowing because it tells us some bit of insight into where Poe was going. And we know that parrots can parrot or mimic words that they hear. And he's giving this quality to this raven. It tells us something about the intention of the raven, or really the lack of intention. And it's creepy. He says, if any literary work is too long to be read at one sitting, we must be content to dispense with the immensely important effect derivable from unity of impression. I'm not sure I need to read anymore. Okay. I determined to produce continuously novel effects with the variation of the application of the refrain. Nevermore. The refrain itself remaining, for the most part, unvaried. So if we know that Poe is really good at creating effect, then we go to the beginning of this poem, and once again, it's in the dark. Once upon a midnight dreary, it's a dark night. While I pondered weak and weary, so he's lonely, and he's experiencing sorrow, and the outside dreariness is a reflection of his interior dreariness. He's reading forgotten lore or dark stories from the past. And something taps, as we know, and we wonder, Poe has set us up for this. There's something tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. It's a bleak December, again reflecting that's the character's speaker, the character's interior, It's nightmarish. It reflects his subconscious. And each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. You know what that looks like? If you ever have a fire, it leaves ghostly shadows. From my book, Surcease of Sorrow, Sorrow for the Lost Lenore. Okay, so now we've got a dead heroine. We frequently have dead heroines. She's dead, Lenore. In the next stanza, they filled me with fantastic terrors. His interior, the ghosts are making him fearful. He's worried about why would I have at midnight a visitor? It's a mystery. Of course, that's characteristic of Gothicism, the mystery. And maybe you have read this a million times, but maybe you never noticed these elements that, according to Poe, he put in with mathematical calculation. We notice in the fourth stanza that he had been napping. Was I? Was I asleep? I don't even remember, he thinks to himself. And so faintly you came tapping. Gently you came rapping. I'm sure that's happened to you. You are sitting in your chair watching something on TV and you fall asleep and then you wake up and you think, did I just dream that? Or maybe you have a dream right before you wake up in the morning and it lurks with you and you think all day long, did that really happen? That happens to me all the time. And then I think all day long, something's lurking here. That's the mystery. And he says, but I was napping, and you gently came rapping. And he opens the door, and it's only darkness. Again, some of the characteristics. Next paragraph, stanza. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. Here is an element. His subconscious is becoming projected into his consciousness. And these are his dreams. And yet the dreams, he's now afraid of the dreams, and he's projecting it into the hallway. But silence. I'm in the fifth stanza. Silence is unbroken, and stillness gave no token, and only the word there spoken was whispered, Lenore, are you there? And I whispered, and echo murmured back, Lenore. What? But she's dead. It's the raven, because he parroted it, we think. Back into the chamber, all my soul within me burning. So he's again creating this atmosphere. It's dark and dreary, and he's scared, and he doesn't know if he's dreaming. Last line of this sixth stanza, 'tis the wind and nothing more. The tumult in the weather is a reflection of the tumult in his mind. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. But as we know, the raven is not a saintly symbol. It's of death. And in walks the raven. Sometimes it makes me laugh when I'm looking out the window and robins walk across my driveway. They walk. Why are they walking? Well, that's what this guy does. He walks. Raven. And he walks. But he flies up and stands on the bust of Pallas. Pallas is the god of wisdom, and it's a white marble statue, a bust of Pallas. But he's not. But the raven is the exact opposite, and he's perched on his head, and he's black, of course. But we are to derive from this that he's not wise. The raven is not wise. He is the opposite of the bust, the god of wisdom. I said, ghastly grim, an ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore, tell me why thy lordly name is on the night's plutonium shore. Plutonium, of course, or Plutonian, is the underworld. It's hell. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the eye speaker, this guy starts to think that the raven is conveying wisdom, but he's asking the questions that can be answered by the word nevermore. He doesn't even realize it. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. But we will see that as the eye speaker progresses, he kind of walks into this answer. Bird or beast upon the sculpted bust above his chamber door with such a name as Nevermore? He's really puzzled. And he goes at the end of the 10th stanza, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. See what I mean? He's asking questions that can be answered by nevermore. And what other friends have flown before? Lenore. Lenore's gone. Next stanza, this is 11. Note the mood and the feelings. Doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock in store, caught from some unhappy master whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges, funeral songs, of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of nevermore. Well, Lenore is nevermore. Hades is a place of nevermore. Death is also nevermore. But notice how followed fast and followed faster till his songs at one burden bore. Because he uses such short little words, the progress is faster and faster. He's getting more and more upset. Stanza 12. What this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. So this is a bird. It's just a bird. And though we know it's symbolic of death, and that he's giving him all of these qualities, grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, ominous bird of yore, meant in croaking. Why is he saying nevermore? In answer to his questions, which he's really setting himself up to scare himself. So he looks at this bird with the fiery eyes. This and I sat divining, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating over. So in this stanza, Poe describes the interior of this room. There's a lamp light, and there's velvet violet lining. Velvet's smooth. It reverberates of the furnishings in a castle. We don't know where he is. He's in some sort of little room. It, to me, sounds like the interior room of a castle or of an abbey. If you go to the next stanza, then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer. You know that thing in church that goes like this, and it has incense. So he's starting to smell this. Well, you know that it's kind of in his imagination, swung by seraphim or angels, like in church. And then he says, by these angels he hath sent thee respite and nepenthe. That's a kind of drug used that was used at the time, but it also causes one to forget. And quoth the raven, nevermore. He says, from thy memories of the Lenore. Are you talking about Lenore? So he has now convinced himself that he's from hell or from the beyond and bringing him news of Lenore. And he's referring to him as a prophet. If bird or devil, whether tempters send like a devil or a tempest tossed the weather outside. And down at the bottom in this paragraph, is there balm in Gilead, which is another medicine? Tell me, I implore, quoth the raven. You're getting the idea of this, the desperation in the character, the insanity of this character, who is now losing grip of his grasp of reality. Tell his soul, this is in the 16th stands out. I keep saying paragraph. But that heaven that bends us above, by that God we both adore, tell this soul who's sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden, that just means Eden, heaven, tell me if I'm going to see her in heaven. Clasp a radiant and clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels named Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. You, and he takes that to mean you're not going to see her. And he's getting to be frantic in the next paragraph. By that word our sign in parting, bird or fiend I shrieked up, starting. He's flipped. He's become mad. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's plutonium shore. That's just the hell. Take thy beak from out my heart and take thy form from off my door, quoth the raven, nevermore. Now the eye speaker thinks the raven's never going to go away either. So we see, as we often see in Poe's stories, like in Telltale Heart, the eye speaker's slow descent into madness. And we witness that in this character as well. And he has allowed himself to believe that the raven has insight. And we know it's just a parrot of some word that the raven heard. O raven never flitting, and the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. So he is tasked by this encounter with the bird to either forget Lenore or try to preserve her in his memory. But like many Gothic stories, we have a dead heroine here. We do. And he is mourning her to such a degree that he has driven himself insane. And the catalyst is an unknowing raven. The bird, it's just a bird from outside. If it's even there, we don't know that for sure. I think the bird's probably there. I think the bird came in and sat on the white marble statue of Pallas, who, and notice it's pallid Pallas, so because it's white marble, and he stands in opposition to the raven. So my point in examining these stories is, especially in Poe, because he's known to be the master of especially American Gothic fiction, but it's such a popular and important form that when my kids were in high school, there was a group of kids at the high school. My kids went to Homestead, and so I'm sure most high schools have this. There was a group of kids who called themselves Goths, and they were outside the norm. They wore black clothes and black makeup, and they frequently dyed whatever color hair they had to black because they were also immersing themselves in this Gothic form. I don't know if they read Stephen King. I have no idea. I'm not even sure they read, but this form is still alive and well, and it still lives. Now, I could go on a bit. What time is it? Oh, I only have 5 minutes left. All right. So I think what we're going to do is stop here. I had pretty much intended that I wasn't going to finish all 3 of these stories. So we'll pick up with Gilman next week in the yellow wallpaper, sorry. she was writing a number of years after Poe, but one of the things that was important in Gilman, and we see again the descent into madness, but Gilman was also a thinker of the period at the end of the 1800s. And one of the key concepts that she wrote about was women in the economy and the importance of women having independent economics. And this piece, and I'm assuming that you have read this, this piece was pretty much autobiographical because it is about postpartum depression and the treatment of it and what was required, what was thought appropriate for postpartum depression at the end of the 1800s. This was a treatment promoted by, last name was Weir, and it was that all stimulation was to be withdrawn. And so, you can see that in the yellow paper. She's shut up in a bedroom that is where the bed is nailed to the floor, and there's nothing in the bedroom. You will notice also that she isn't caring for her baby. The baby's been taken away and is being cared for by the husband's sister. So all stimulation was removed from her. That was the treatment for postpartum depression. So at that, I'm going to close here, but we will pick this story up. I have some things to tell you about Gilman, and then we will look at the Gothic, I forgot my word, at the Gothic elements that Gilman used to convey the descent into madness. All right, so I will see you next week, and if you have any questions, you can shoot them to me in email. Otherwise, I will see you next week, and we will resume with the creepy and the weird.